The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
All right. Welcome to tonight's Dukes Court. Tonight I'm here with my co-host, Chris the Stilt Fletcher, Gary Magic Kinn, and since I'm bitter, I'm going to go away from the Laker nicknames, and I'll be just Pistol Dave Finoli. Welcome, gentlemen.
Welcome, Dave. Chris.
Oh, glad to be here, fellas.
Your day got very nice yesterday,
Number 7 in that purple uniform, purple, yellow, and green uniform. So.
Oh, man.
It's a beautiful thing, gentlemen. It's a beautiful thing.
I'll tell you. Well, your team has become an automatic contender. So, and you are correct. It is good when teams from L.A. or New York are successful in this league, and certainly brings on a good rivalry again with the Celtics, who I would put as the NBA Eastern Division favorite right now early on.
Yeah, a lot can happen over the year, though, so we'll see.
Yeah, listen to him being a good sportsman, Gary.
Certainly makes a splash. That's the one.
It does.
For a league that's, I think, other than ESPN and other than under a certain age group, I think struggling for attention certainly makes a splash. So.
No, and he certainly joins. I mean, the list of legends that have the Laker have put on the Laker uniform. He's certainly a very worthy addition to that list. But anyways, tonight we're going to start off not talking about basketball. We're going to start off as we get into induction month in baseball. We will talk about the one controversy that never goes away. It's been constant among baseball fans over the past, actually, pretty much through the past century, this century. Whether or not the suspected steroid boy should be inducted into the Hall of Fame. And I'll tell you what, gentlemen, I've gone back and forth with this over the years. In '98, that was one of my great memories as a sports fan. Daily listening, watching when I could, McGuire versus Sosa versus McGuire, it saved the game. The home run race was one of the most exciting events in my sports time, and I think that probably makes me a little more on the bitter side with what has gone on towards these guys. You hear the point. I mean, the point, everybody was on them, which if you hear the discussion around, there was a high percentage of guys on them. You can't say everybody, but there was a high percentage of the guys on them. And in my estimation, the way the baseball writers have done this is purely as asinine as some of the other decisions they make. I don't know how they routinely pick a guy like Piazza, who admitted in the last few years to have doing steroids, claiming he did them when they were legal, but McGuire did the same thing, and yet he doesn't get in. And Pudge Rodriguez has been mentioned in there. Backman has been mentioned, but the most unbelievable thing to me is putting in Bud Selig, who looked over that era with a blind eye and certainly was as guilty as the rest. So I've heard that. I've tried to, in my head, justify, okay, these Barry Bonds, probably a Hall of Famer anyway. I won't make the claim. I'm one of the few that might not make the claim that Clemens wasn't an automatic pick, because when his stats started to decline in Boston, to me he was borderline at best before his miraculous resurgence in his late 30s to being the greatest pitcher of all time, which obviously is another irritation towards seeing him get in. But you've had others like Joe Morgan, who gives his impassioned plea to the electors not wanting the guys in. The ones that kind of irritate me are the guys that say, well, people have been on things throughout history of the game. Babe Ruth was on them, which is, he may have been, I don't know, but it's ridiculous to say because there's no proof other than the fact he ate a lot. I don't know where the proof is and how you can make those claims. You can either make the claims in the 70s that the amphetamines, the greenies, so to speak, that were widely available should negate the people of the 70s from being in, which, again, might not have been a legal thing to do, but they didn't have the effect to the stats. That's what offends me, is the effects to the stats that steroids have had on the game. I mean, to me, that is the sacred thing about this game over the rest of sports, is the stats, the 714 home runs, the 60 home runs by Ruth, the 61 by Maris. I mean, to assume they were on some sort of performance-enhancing drugs without any proof is just, to me, not an argument you can make. The people have abused these, and basically the argument is coming down to 5 men: Bonds, Palmeiro, Sosa, McGuire, and Clemens. Personally, bottom line, I really could give a rat's behind whether any of them get in. I think that scandal to me is one that I put in with the Pete Rose and Joe Jackson. In fact, I'd probably rather have those two in. The only argument that makes sense to me is it's a museum, and doesn't things outside the game shouldn't be considered when putting them in. But these were things that alter their stats. Palmeiro, to me, doesn't get the stats without it. McGuire probably doesn't get the stats without it. He was too injured. Again, Clemens, I thought, was borderline when he was looking at the end of his career with Boston, so I don't think he gets them in. I really don't care that they get in. I get a little frustrated with I don't know how the writers are saying, well, Sammy Sosa, you're only going to get 7% of the vote. Clemens, you're going to get 50% of the vote. I mean, Bonds 56. I mean, Sosa wasn't in the level of Bonds, but he certainly was in the ballpark that, I don't know how you're making the distinction between the two. But bottom line, I guess as I've gone back and forth, I'm not a fan of them going in, and I really don't even buy put a asterisk next to their name as you put them in. Fletch?
Well, Dave, I understand what you're saying, and I would say to you, how many players are already inducted in the Hall of Fame that use steroids, HGH, or other performance-enhancing drugs in their careers? We probably can't count them on one hand. I think that you're overlooking the effect of greenies or amphetamines, and they did help people's stats, because those players were able to play on a game that maybe they might not have been able to play. So they were in the lineup. Now, does it inflate their stats the way that the steroids did? No, probably not. But, when we're supposed to keep anybody out who ever used performance-enhancing drugs, well, that door's already been knocked off its hinges, I think. And Bonds, I think he was a Hall of Famer before. Clemens, also a Hall of Famer before. And, here's the thing, guys. They failed just as many drug tests as everyone who's going to be inducted in Cooperstown this year, and that's 0. These two men were easily the greatest players of their era, and that just happened to be the steroid era. Think about it. There was no testing until 2005, and steroid was about as common, I would say, almost as chewing tobacco. But nobody really cared. It goes back to what you were talking about, Dave, in that 1998 season. That home run race brought people back to baseball after the strike season. And Bud Selig had no choice but to turn a blind eye to it. It was bringing them back. And Clemens leading the Yankees to 2 of 3 consecutive World Series titles. So again, he brought New York back to that. So I think it was really important. The guy I feel really sorry for in all of this is Fred McGriff. Here's a guy who hit 493 homers. He drove in 1,500 plus runs, and he's not even getting a sniff for Hall of Fame contention whenever, because his stats were dwarfed by some of those other guys. So to me, my line of demarcation involving PED users on the Hall of Fame ballot is whether or not a player tested positive or suspended at any time in their career. So for me, Alex Rodriguez is out. Manny Ramirez is out because they were both suspended. But the thing that's going to be interesting, you mentioned Piazza, next year with Andy Pettitte, because here's a guy who had the stats, who also said he admitted to using steroids, although he used the old "I only tried it one time" routine, which, it's sort of like when you get caught speeding. You say to the cop, "I only sped this one time." So it's going to be interesting to see how the writers handle that.
Well, I see what you're saying. I personally think Selig did have a choice. He might not have had a choice from a business standpoint, but he certainly had the ethical choice, which, again, that's a back and forth argument. But it's tough to say if you got kicked out, which I agree with. I can see that line. But you have Bonds, for all intents and purposes, there's proof on him having used steroids. Palmeiro and Clemens, certainly neither really had a chance to pass their drug test, and both seem to have significant evidence that they were on it. And again, that's where the inconsistency. Sosa, as I look through, the only thing I see there is an undocumented test in 2003 that he may or may not have failed. He seems to have, according to what you're saying there, he would seem to have the best opportunity to get through, because there's nothing as substantial as there is with the other guys. And you're right, Fred McGriff is the guy that gets hurt in this because of what these guys did to inflate their stats. Gary, what are your thoughts on some of this?
Yeah, it's funny. It's amazing. The three of us know each other a long time, been following this stuff a long time, and we're all over the lot on it. So I guess you can understand a little bit kind of, how controversial this whole issue is. I think, to me, it isn't just stats. I think that's one of the things here that, the writers talk out of both sides of their mouth. They want to make a decision on giving somebody the Cy Young who goes 14-13 on a team that finishes fourth because of his stats, but then they want to have the right to say here, well, the guy was accused of this, or he got caught in PED use in an era that, quite frankly, because of Selig's actions and the other ownership group and everything else, the ownership group and the leadership of the game basically didn't care. Well, that guy did that, so we want to keep him out. You can't talk out of both sides of your mouth, in my view, in this issue. And, I think, I'm not sure, Dave, I really care that much whether they're in or not. I don't think it's going to change anything about the game's future. I don't think it's going to reduce ticket sales or pilgrimages to Cooperstown. I'm not sure it's as big of an issue as some people are making it out to be. But, I think to talk about the fact that this was so wrong and this was so awful is a little bit disingenuous. Anybody who played the game before 1920 who's in the Hall of Fame is questionable. And I can list a number of things here when you think about it if we go back through it. 1903 World Series, not proven, no internet, reporters in those days not all over everything, a lot of stuff done on trains or dark rooms, rumors about whether or not one of those teams, why Doheny didn't pitch, why Philippe had to pitch 3 times, what's going on in that World Series. 05, rumors, with the 3 shutouts from Matheson. 08 race, documented evidence. If you read anything about Pulliam, who was the NL president at the time, and some of the other ownership group, they basically swept under the rug that the Giants tried to bribe the Phillies into losing 3 or 4 games in the pennant race. Questions about the 1914 series. The A's were a dominant team. They lose to a team that was lucky to win the NL pennant. Yeah, it got hot in the second half, but questionable. 1918 World Series, Red Sox and Cubs, that's as smelly as 1919 is. Just not talked about as much. So not PED use, not to, drive up your contract value and that kind of stuff, but, to talk about the fact that this is such an awful era. That was the era. That era was created by a lot of things. That was created by the leadership group of the game, which had plenty of chance to deal with this issue when they shut down the season in 1994. For Selig to publicly out there, if you look at the articles, to say, well, those people say we didn't deal with it. Too bad, it was collective bargaining. Well, you shut down the season over a bunch of things. You shut it down over revenue sharing, but you didn't deal with this? I'm not saying that it's right to cheat, but the fact of the matter is the environment was created for this kind of activity. So, and then, it isn't just the steroid use that drove up a lot of these guys' numbers. Ruth, And guys like that were hitting in big ballparks and stuff like that where there was plenty of foul territory. You took all the foul territory away in all these new ballparks when they started building booming ballpark. Everybody started building a booming new big ballpark after Camden Yards opened in 1992. The strike zone became the size of a postcard. I mean, as you said a number of times we talked about baseball, Dave, that drives up the offense. I mean, how do you separate, the offensive numbers some of these guys put up from some of those things? I'm not sure you can easily do that. Expansion. I mean, I thought expansion 1977 diluted the American League quite a bit, made the competitive balance change a little bit. You added 4 more teams in the 1990s, and you put that with all the foul territory and some of that stuff. I mean, some of these numbers are skewered clearly because of PED use. Nobody's going to be fool enough to say that they weren't. But that's not the only factor. I mean, it's the leadership of the game. It's the ignorance of some things or just ignoring it. I'm not sure, Dave, that it saved the game in 1998 or not, but it certainly brought attention back after eliminating a season with no title holder in 1994. But, I mean, I always think the game's going to be fine anyway, even the era we're going through now. So, I mean, I think it does boil down to about 5 names, and it's interesting. I'm a little bit different on some of those 5 names. I mean, if we're going to talk about statistics as a primary criterion for giving awards and deciding the Hall of Fame, whether or not you think somebody used PEDs or not, they still have those numbers. I mean, how many guys have 7 MVPs like Bonds, 8 Gold Gloves, 2 batting titles, 14 All-Star appearances, beyond the homers and the RBIs, 15 times over 100 walks? I mean, it's almost impossible. If you want to put some asterisk on it, go ahead. But how you can say that the guy doesn't belong in there with all those numbers, whether he used, HGH or not, is beyond me. I mean, Rodriguez's numbers are huge, but he changed the game. How many shortstops other than Ripken prior to that point were thought about as an offensive force? He clearly came along and changed the game. I mean, yes, he's a known user. I agree with you on that, Fletch. But he still had those numbers. He still has all those. I don't think steroids are the only reason he had 14 100-plus RBI seasons or 696 home runs and stuff like that. Clemens, I mean, honestly, it's hard to like the guy. I mean, anything you read about the guy, I mean, any team he was on, nobody cared for the guy. But, I mean, 7 Cy Youngs, 2 times a pitching triple crown, 354 wins. I mean, we've got guys in there that have nowhere near that amount of wins, whether they use steroids or not. I mean, I think you have to put some of these guys in and qualify it however you want. I don't feel that the 3 that you mentioned, Dave, deserve all that much consideration. I mean, So McGuire hit 553 lifetime home runs. Was he a game-changing force? Yeah, there are 3 seasons where he hit under 200, or under 220 rather. I mean, he was an average fielder at best. He won Gold Glove, which a lot of people's mind was questionable. Sosa does have the numbers. He was never found guilty. He never won anything. His teams never won anything. Honestly, I'm not really sure that he was even that good of a ball player other than the fact he hit the ball out of the park. Palmeiro was a good ball player. He had put up a lot of statistics. Again, a lot of teams that were average at best, never really won anything, wasn't necessarily considered a force by a lot of people. You could pitch to him. I mean, there's plenty of other people that are in there, too, that people don't talk about. Beyond Piazza, how about Frank Thomas? I mean, there were rumors about him, too. Maybe he was smart enough to avoid the testing and some of that stuff. He's in there with far less numbers than these guys. There's questions about him. How did the writers come up with the fact that he's clean? Because it wasn't shown up on the Mitchell report? Mitchell himself indicated that report was not complete. So, I mean, to me, I think you got to consider them all in, and I think who made these writers the judge of moral character in, quite frankly, a sport that's been devoid of moral character for 100 years? So, I mean, I think that most of them deserve serious consideration, but why do they do it? I mean, somebody who's won Gold Gloves and won home run titles or batting titles, somebody who's piled up those kinds of pitching statistics, or somebody who changed the way their thinking was in the game, that may not be hard, fast numbers, but to me, that's a key criterion for consideration. So that's my view on it, Dave. I mean, I don't love the era. It's an ugly black mark era. It was caused by a lot of things, but honestly, I don't really see how you can keep them out. I mean, if you're going to keep them out, then you better go back and look at a lot of things over the game's history, including what you guys said about the 70s. So.
Well, I think one thing you look at, and I'll agree with you on Bonds, and I've always would claim that I wouldn't have a problem on him. He was might have been the biggest ass of the group, but He was a Hall of Famer.
Not saying
before.
something, too, by the way.
Yeah, that is true. That is true.
That's correct. In that group, think about it. Right.
See, where I come up with Clemens, he's 35 years old. He's losing his stuff severely, and he goes on to win 4 Cy Youngs and become the greatest pitcher of all time after 35. I just can't. I can't get through that. I try in my head to get through it. I can't get through it. But one thing you bring up that absolutely is an issue is the people that are deciding who gets in the Hall of Fame and who doesn't. And that's one of the points I made. How can you say, I'm not saying Sosa deserves in, but if we're going to put these guys in, how do you keep them out? I mean, he has stats that very few people, even people in his era, would have. And I know I'm talking out of both sides of my ass right now, but looking at the devil's advocate point, how do you decide who to put in or who to put out? McGwire hit, and again, I don't think McGwire was a game changer. I agree with you 100%. I think you take the steroid aspect of him, and he's probably no more than a Dave King.
Plugging first baseman for a time. Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So I think that becomes part of the argument too. I just, that's the one thing that bothers me about Clemens is just when he was done with the Red Sox, he just seemed like he was done. And I memean, 354 victories, he was barely above 200 at that point. So he's almost doubled his victory total above 35 years old. There's just something inherently wrong about that. I get what you guys are saying, and I'm not saying, I don't agree with it because it makes sense. And there were a lot of guys in there, although a lot of the things in the early part of the century, the 1908 thing, they handled that wrong. In fact, the Cubs tried to, there was a rumor, and I got through this doing research. I actually have Pulliam in our book, Unlucky 21, and they even tried to bribe the judge, reportedly, or not judge, umpires, for the playoff game against the
08 playoff game. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So, yeah, there are things at that. I mean, 03, Doheny actually was in an insane asylum at the time, which is why he didn't pitch. And again, reportedly, Lever's arm was hurt. They were down pretty much to 2 healthy pitchers, which is what the official report is on why Felipe pitched the 3 games. But again, you don't know. We weren't there.
There was Krieger made some comments for the Red Sox that Gambers approached him to throw some of those games. Now, it's a different issue, but I think that's the trouble that I'm having, Dave Fletch, with the whole situation. It's an ugly era. This is the American game, apple pie, Chevrolet, July 4th, all that kind of stuff. And it was an era that, quite frankly, turned a blind eye to a lot of ugliness. Yeah. I don't like it, okay? I don't like it at all. I don't like how, when you look at numbers now, if you're exposed to baseball the first time, you got some of these guys who clearly, I think, violated the rules and cheated in those numbers. But that's what the conditions were. Well, I mean, you can say, well, there was a bunch of players at Major League Baseball that didn't cheat. Well, take a look at the Mitchell report. Matt Herges, Jack Cust, David Bell. I mean, these guys were average players at best. If that's what was found out, what about wasn't found out? Right. I mean, Canseco was a jerk himself, but if you read some of the stuff, he basically said this was routine behavior in most of the Major League clubs at the time. And honestly, that's where I think, as usual, Selig becomes Teflon Man. I mean, he was leading an ownership group that, quite frankly, thought the game never is good enough, just like we're in the environment now, and turned a blind eye to that stuff. That doesn't justify somebody cheating to get numbers or to get, contracts or something like that or money. But, I mean, let's face it, baseball's a money-making business. So, they were kind of made for each other. So, I just think the writers now, to me, it just amazes me with their overall morality in the thing. I mean, and honestly, Morgan's thing, I don't know how you guys feel about it. I mean, honestly, Joe, I think you better get over yourself. I mean, as you alluded to, Fletch, that whole era from 1971, whether it's Ellis pitching coked up in San Diego to the Pirate Parrot distributing speed to players as they came to, that whole era's got its question marks. So, I mean, it's amazing how he could turn his eye to that and start to criticize these guys. It just shows you what a simple mind, in my view. I mean, honestly. So
a couple other things, guys. I mean, these same writers who are trying to take that moral high ground, where were they when that was happening? They weren't making those calls then saying, oh, something's wrong. So that's one thing. The other thing that you have to be really careful about is it becomes a real slippery slope because, even though, we pretty much all feel that Clemens was juicing at that time, you know what, a lot of the batters that he was facing were too. And, when you got to a point there where a lot of these players were, they felt like to even remain in the game because of the way the competition had gone, they were almost forced to make some decisions on that, whether they were going to juice or whether they were not. And it was, how do you have someone like a Brady Anderson hit 50 home runs one year and never come anywhere near that again? So, I mean, I think it was so rampant that it's hard to, it's a very difficult era. And I think that there are some players that were clearly the class of that generation, and you have to look at them. But, if they didn't test positively, if they weren't caught, you're just doing this on suspicion. And that's the crime in this whole thing, is because you don't know who was and who wasn't. So how do you make decisions based on that?
That's my point.
Well, and that's part of the issue. I mean, and I think this is probably the most flawed Hall of Fame election situation in all of professional sports and all of sports. I would think I like the way football does it. I don't necessarily think you have to have a minimum in it or a maximum in every year, but I like that 32 experts get together and discuss among each other and come up with a conclusion. Not that they get it right every time, and not that they don't have their prejudices, but I just, that's the other thing that confuses me about the whole other thing. How are you making your decisions? I mean, are you making it purely on stats? If you are, again, why is Sosa getting 7.8% of the vote and Bonds getting 56%?
That's right.
I mean,
that's the point I'm making. Right. What you make up your mind.
If you're going to do this, it's almost as if you have to use it like a Negro League status, form a committee, and decide once and for all who the hell gets in and who the hell doesn't. Because it's ridiculous the way it is now. It makes the situation that much more. It irritates me, but it also makes it comical in a way that, Jesus. I mean, how are you making these decisions? They look like asses, basically.
That's what.
The other thing is that because exactly what you're talking about, Dave, baseball will never get closure on this because every year it's going to be brought back up again. So why not do what you're suggesting? Put together a blue ribbon panel, get some players involved, and let them have some recommendations. But the fact of the matter was, that was the era, and for better or worse, I mean, we saw some incredible numbers. And the problem is that of all the sports, baseball is the one that's most closely associated with numbers. If I say the number 56, if I say the number 511. Those are numbers that I don't even have to explain them. You know what they mean.
Yeah.
So no other sport has that. So I think that's the other emotional part of this. And Dave, you mentioned that too, is that this had quite a bearing on the stats. And Gary, what you're saying is true as well. I mean, the ballpark design, the baseballs were more tightly wound, a lot of different things. But you know what? Chicks dig the long ball. That's why all this stuff was done. People like seeing the home runs. It was
the greatest non-Pirate pennant baseball season I went through. Although I find the most troubling part of the Mitchell report is the fact more Pirates are on there than just about any other team, and they were that lousy. So we cheated, but we cheated very poorly.
Yeah, well, that is true. Kevin Young and a bunch of them are on there, and you're like, wow. And I think that's the part, to me, seriously, that makes this, from the the Baseball Writers Association, everything else. I mean, whose numbers are more legitimate, Ruth or Bonds, home run wise? Well, that's questionable forever, Fletch. I couldn't agree with you more. We'll never really know that answer. Okay, for all the different factors: time, ballparks, environment, number of teams, blah blah blah. But the bottom line is, he still hit them, and that was the era we were in. So, I mean, I think if you can't talk out of both sides of your mouth if you're the writers. If you want to talk about statistics, you want to talk about statistics in the awards voting, and you want to talk about statistics for the Hall of Fame, these guys did these things. I don't know if the asterisk matters. Do whatever you want. Put it on a plaque. I don't think it makes any difference.
Well, yeah, and I think that's asinine too. I mean, you put them in, you put their career in. You don't put them in there and then try to humiliate them once they're in.
Right.
I mean, that's just bullshit also. I mean, there is no decent answer. I mean, again, this would be my solution to just end the controversy, because on the other end, I'm sick of hearing about it.
Me
you
too.
know, it was, and you know, I mean, is it the great Billy Rainier always makes the argument, because he's you know, he goes back and forth, but he makes the argument, at least they were cheating to try to win. You don't put in the gamblers because, you know, they weren't cheating to win. And again, I think that has its merit too.
Does.
You know,
yeah.
But as I said, that just, I think
your
it's not for
right
Clemens and Bonds being more dominant once they got past their prime. And again, I don't know why it bothers me so much, because normally this kind of stuff really doesn't. And maybe it's just the love of the numbers that I have, as we all do, that maybe scares me a little too much. But that 35 and over, playing the game that nobody has ever played it, I don't know why it just bothers me. It does though.
I understand why it bothers you, and I don't disagree with you. Unfortunately, I mean, I do. And I don't think there's much doubt about the circumstance. I mean, Bonds' silence and Clemens' behavior to discredit some kind of physical trainer pretty much tells you that they were guilty of infractions.
Oh. Was it Palmeiro or Clemens that threw his wife under the bus? I think it was Clemens.
I can't remember now. You're right, though. One of them did. I mean, it's just an ugly era that unfortunately we went through. I do think that I think that the loss of potential money, and I think all the other entertainment options caused baseball to really get control. I don't think Selig or any of those owners really cared about the game that much. They cared about the money they were making. I think that they felt they were in trouble after all this controversy, and I think the problem is now under control.
Yeah.
But it's interesting. There's more home runs hit last year than ever. Nobody's talking about it.
Right.
And I think that's another interesting thing with the writers group. Like, should they be making a big fuss about this? Now, do I think that these guys are juicing up with being tested so much? No. But they're not looking at the other factors. They're not looking at the size of the parks. They're not looking at the expansion. They're not looking at, quite frankly, pitching strategy, which has dramatically changed and is probably for the worse. Some of that stuff was happening during the era that these guys piled up those numbers, and nobody talks about that.
And if you listen to what they say, the ball was juiced last year, which, again, don't like, but I guess, I don't know, in my head, maybe it's not consistent, but in my head, that's a little more acceptable than somebody juicing up to hit it. But, and again, I certainly, again, could be talking out of both sides of my ass. I can see that point, but I have a talented ass. But anyways.
I just don't think you got to make up your mind. I mean, if we're going to talk about, 600 home runs is a criterion. Well, these guys hit 600 home runs. I mean, who's genius enough to say that of those, 583 McGuire hit or the 696 Rodriguez hit? Well, so many of those came from steroid use. How do you explain a Jack Cust or David Bell, like I say? How do you explain that then? Like, I mean, I still think that the talent level is there. And to me, in an era where you got this kind of question mark, go back to, did they change the game? McGuire didn't change the game at all. He was an average fielder at best. He was a DH half the time. He had a bunch of seasons really didn't hit anything. He had seasons where he played less than 50 games. I mean, I think Sosa changed the game a little bit. He certainly put the Cubs back on the map. He had some big RBI seasons, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, to me, that's what I focus on. I think Bonds did change the way you looked at guys, where they could hit first or fourth. Rodriguez did with that position. I mean, if you get that's subjective too, but at least to me, that's somewhat of a criterion that makes some sense. Whereas, well, you know, the whole era is full of juicing. Well, yeah. Baseball's got plenty of eras in it that have a lot of question marks about it. So,
right.
But listen, you know, you have the guys before 1947 really not having to play against some of the most talented players in the world. So, you know, it's never an easy answer. But I think that the problem is that this thing's gonna be revisited until those guys are on the ballot for the old timers committee to take a look at it. And then there's going to be all the players that say, no, we're not going to have anyone cheat on this. So it's never going to go away until you try to come up with some solution.
Yeah. No.
Well, you can't say what do you guys think about the Morgan situation? I mean, do you really think that's a realistic view of this? Like, I mean, do you really think that to me bothered me as much as
I think it's realistic from the players in his era. I think it's a consistent sentiment among players in his era, and I think that's why if you're going to put together a committee, I'm not sure you want a player from that era in there, because they seem to be very steadfast in their belief that they don't want these guys in the Hall of Fame. Mm-hmm. Right or wrong, that seems to be consistent with what I read.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. So
I just think it's a very naive view. And I think it's a lack of understanding of baseball history, in my view.
It could be very much. I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying where I think it's coming from. I
think you guys are right. I just think that's nice to look at in a vacuum. Yeah. But you know, I mean, they also, you know, somebody who piled up Rod Carew. I loved Rod Carew, but he played a lot of AstroTurf. Hit a ball in AstroTurf, the ball rolled through like it was a pool ball on a table. I mean, we didn't have that in the 90s.
Right.
So, I mean, that's the part that you just can't – it's like I always say about boxing. It's nice to talk about. I'm not sure you can really compare era to era, and I think in this case, known cheating should never be condoned in anything. I'm not supporting that for anybody who's listening to this, but unfortunately you create an environment where you paid contracts on performance standards. You made ballparks, midget league ballparks. You expanded way too much, probably, when it comes right down to it. You didn't control this thing, and you had chances. You had chances more than once to get a hold of the thing. What do you think is going to happen?
Which, again, all those factors are true, but bottom line, we have the same factors now, and nobody comes close to those numbers. So I think
it's clear that there was a problem.
Steroids were the major contributing factor to all that. And you're right. All that did have an effect on it, without a doubt. But I do think that is the one, if you compare, even though we had a record amount of home runs, it wasn't. It was more spread out.
73 outs, correct.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. But
exactly.
Anyways, we're going to pop to our second subject of the night. The NFL has a new helmet rule, which basically now simply reads, if a player lowers his head to initiate and make contact with his helmet against an opponent, it's considered unnecessary roughness. Carries a 15-yard penalty. Seems simple, but basically it's the Mike Webster effect in this. The autopsy in 2002, the controversy, the CTE controversy since then. This rule, even though simplistic, could radically change the way the game's played. Now, Fletch, I'm going to let you take it from here because of your work with Roberto 21, with brain injuries. You know significantly more about these situations than most. So I'm going to kind of throw it to you and let you talk about this a little bit.
Okay. One of the things that we're doing with our company, RC21X, and also our mobile app, Roberto, we've been working with we're up to close to 700 former NFL players now that their law firms are paying us to monitor their brain performance and give them sort of a recommendation of whether they should go or no go to see if that player would receive an award. And a lot of that is because the requirements of of the settlement was that the players would have to go a full neuropsych evaluation, which can cost anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000. So they're using us as a screening tool to figure out. The actuaries say that about 30% of the former players are going to qualify. And one of the tests that we give these guys is we show them five shapes rather, and they have to put the shapes back in order that they see them as fast as they can. Well, guys, a lot of those guys can't do that. Their short-term memory is shot, and that's from all the hits that they've taken. And the big culprit of that, Dave, is having a three-point stance. That on every play there's a collision. And while this new legislation is well-meaning, I think it's going to be very problematic. They say that there's holding on every play. There's going to be the opportunity to make this call on every play. And I think the preseason is going to be really ugly in the first few games of the season while they try to figure this whole thing out. You have to look at, so let's say I'm a running back, it's third and inches, and I'm about to really lunge to try to get that first down, and I put my head forward. By the letter of the law, that is a 15-yard penalty. If I'm doing a quarterback sneak, that by the letter of the law is a 15-yard penalty. The guys are so big, they're fast, and trying to make these calls in real time, it's going to be just impossible to do. Again, most of the damage happens at the line, and that's, I don't know that this new rule change really does anything to change that.
Now, what would you, obviously there are reports that youth football is the participation is starting to be down considerably, which will affect the game, not right now, but it'll affect the game years down the road. We just lost a kid from Washington State, just killed himself when they did the autopsy. They said he had a brain of a 65-year-old man. The kid with New England who was killed himself in jail after the murder. They said it was the worst case of CTE they had ever seen.
Right.
What would your solution be to try to? I agree with you. I think this could be insane.
Well, I think you have to look at the 3-point stance is one thing. The other thing too is you need to be able to monitor the people. So what happens is, particularly even with high school and youth football, a lot of teams are given what's called the impact test. A lot of the players, and basically what it does is it sets a baseline. So if there's an incident, if they get popped or something like that, and it appears that they have a concussion, they'll run the test with them and they'll see how they fare. The problem with that is that you may take that impact test. The parents don't know what it means. They may not take that test again unless there's an incident. But all the stuff that happens in between, those incremental hits, is really what's causing it. That's what the damage is done. So the one thing you have to do is, one of the tools that we came up with is being able to monitor yourself across that time. That's one thing. But I've talked to Bennett Amalu. He's done some things with our company too, and he's on a crusade now, basically to wipe out football. And now your Brett Favre is coming out and saying that if you want football to be, your kid to be safe from football, don't let them play. So it's going to be really interesting to see how all this happens. Once you got the mom scared, you're seeing, like you said, in youth football, it's declining.
Yeah, I think that's going to become very problematic soon. Gary, what do you look at with the way football is turning at this point and its potential future?
I don't know. Fletcher, you're gonna call me that again. But I think life is a matter of risk and decision. Okay, nobody's telling me smoke or don't smoke. Okay, now I know you're a kid perhaps and your parents are pushing to play football, but if you're going to play a contact sport, you're going to be subject to injury. So, I do think that even with all of these rule changes in the NFL and some of that stuff, there's going to be some stuff that's going to happen. I never played the game, and I'm not a football expert. Probably you guys are far deeper football knowledge in me. I hear you on the three-point stance, but I mean, I do think some of this risk is just inherent in a contact sport. So that's number one. Number two, I don't really think that the NFL is the sole problem. I think the NFL Players Association, similar to baseball and similar to some other sports, has a tendency to talk out of both sides of their mouth. They want all the protections, and they want the ownership group to give them all the protections, but they don't want to change how they think or how they play or how they hit. Pat, I don't know. Sorry about that.
I think that's a very good point, Gary. I think that's a.
I mean, I think that's one
point over the.
I mean, I think you can't talk out of. I mean, for Sherman to come out, who quite frankly never liked the guy to begin with, too much of a big mouth for me, somewhat of a dirty hitter, to say it's ridiculous. Well, then don't be talking about the league protecting anybody, right? Number one. Number two, I think it goes back to a bigger matter. I mean, one of the things that started to turn me off about football was starting to watch that show on HBO. I mean, every one of those coaches, now maybe it was for the cameras, maybe it was because of the mentality of some of this stuff, but, you know, I mean, you shouldn't be glorifying laying people out, injuring people, hard hits for no reason. I mean, the mentality around the game from the coaching staffs from the grade school to the high school on up, I think has to change here. I mean, you know, I think the NFL did a very poor job of dealing with these guys and their concussions and providing information. And, you know, some of it was medical. We just didn't have all the information. But by the same token, I mean, I think the change is going to take a number of years. And I point to hockey, which I know better. You know, there's a lot of talk in hockey that any hit to the head should be eliminated. And if you do it, you should be suspended heavy. And honestly now, you know, quite frankly, a less educated group than football, and quite frankly, a much shorter career and riskier career in some ways in football, you know, there's a groundswell for, you know what, we can play a hard physical game without going for somebody's head. So, you know, I don't think the NFL is on the wrong track here. Now, I do think that probably what they've said here, you know, based upon what you're saying, Fletch, is going to be really problematic. But you got to start somewhere. You have to almost change it like a muscle memory and a mentality change. So, I mean, I think it's a step in it. You can play very hard-hitting football without drilling somebody with your helmet or trying to take somebody's head off. And for years, that was the way the game was played. We got away from that. The NFL needs to do a better job than what they do with glorifying hits and all that kind of stuff. And if networks are doing it, tell them, look, you know, we got a partnership here. What are you doing? Stop putting that stuff all over the air when you lay somebody out and they're laying there completely sprawled. So I think it's a number of things that got to happen here beyond just looking at hitting somebody with a helmet. And it's going to take a number of years to fix it, in my view. But I don't banning football.
I think you're right.
Banning football. That's stupidity. I mean, you know, it's nice for Favre to say that now after he's made millions and he sells a bunch of razors all over the whatever. I mean, what do you say to some people that that's their option, Fletch? I mean, you know, that kind of stuff.
I agree.
Brett, go back to Louisiana and keep your mouth shut. Okay? I mean, honestly, I mean, I don't buy that at all.
So to me, Gary, there's a couple things. One, when you talk about the players knew the risk, as part of that settlement, they actually didn't know the risk. The league was actually giving them information that was counter to what was true. That's why that settlement happened, and that's why they were able to bring that through court, because the NFL lied to them. Now, the other part of it, too, is I agree with you 100%. It's going to take a long time to do this, and it's going to have to start with the kids. And the NFL, to their credit, has been doing some things. They have a program called the Heads Up program where they're teaching kids not to lead with their head. I think that Ryan Shazier injury scared the shit out of the league. It really did. They saw that and they thought, oh my God, this is going to turn off a lot of young players, and they just saw the possibility of even more legislation coming their way and money going out of their pocket. I mean, to me, the worst thing about this is that there are those players that played in years gone by that they may remember details from a game that they played in the 1990s, but if you ask them why they left their house to run an errand, they won't remember it. And there's more than enough money to take care of all these guys. I mean, if you look at what Roger Goodell was paid in this last contract, that was obscene. And some of that money could have been taken, and it could have been used to take care of the players that they built that brand on. That shield was built upon the blood, sweat, and tears of those older guys, and they've been left out in the cold. The delays in people getting their settlement money. The league is stringing it out. It doesn't string it out. These guys aren't getting the money that they need for the care. It's really criminal.
Now, one thing we're gonna see in the book Unlucky 21. Chris is going to have a chapter on the Mike Webster situation, and as I read about that, I mean, just he was a shell of a man at that point towards the end of his life. I mean, that research just must have been eye-opening as you go through it.
Well, it is, and I was very involved with the Mario Lemieux Foundation and doing some of the the golf tournament stuff early on. And there were a lot of people there that were involved with that who were friends with Mike Webster. And, I talked to some of them, and just what they saw and how horrible it was for him at the end. It really breaks your heart. And I got to tell you guys, it really makes you look at watching football completely differently. And exactly what you're talking about, Gary. When you see someone getting lit up for no apparent reason, if their back is turned, you see this defenseless wide receivers getting popped by a linebacker when going over the middle. You think about that more than you did before. At least I do.
And not to be political, but it certainly doesn't help when the president is calling them in essence a bunch of pussies. That kind of irritated me too, because it's a situation that must be addressed. We don't need to see guys have to live their lives after football in utter chaos like that because of unnecessary head injuries. And I've the stuff you've told me about the company you work for, I just think it's an intriguing way to hopefully attack the problem. And it sounds like it's a way that starting at the lowest levels could work to, if not eliminate it, severely reduce the issues. I just think it's fascinating.
I mean, I think that there's two other issues here that I think really need to be thought about. I mean, if you have an organization that now, the Steelers look very poor, perhaps outside of Pittsburgh or every place else with everything that happened, with all those linemen had their troubles and what they were doing or not doing, what they were telling those guys or not telling those guys. But I think if you have an organization that, quite frankly, is ignoring the effects of some of this stuff that you see happen to a guy like Webster, you need to penalize that. You need to I don't care if it's the Dallas Cowboys. You need to seriously penalize that, whether it's hit him in the pocket or something else. That kind of stuff cannot go on. And we shouldn't just look at the ownership group in Goodell. The Players Association as well is guilty. I mean, just like in baseball, this Players Association thinks solely about themselves. They had a chance to allocate more money to some of those guys' care, some of that research and stuff like that. I think they refused it 2 or 3 times. I mean, their greed is solely for themselves. Well, I got a short career. Well, everybody playing the NFL does.
Yeah.
Right?
And
I mean, they could have
those who had a long career are worse off.
That's exactly right. I mean, they could have a longer-term view of that situation, and they didn't. So, and everybody loved Upshaw, but he, quite frankly, didn't think about the long-term when he was the leadership, and I don't even know who it is now.
I mean, look at Webster. He played 15 years. No Steelers played more. He's been in 202 games. No Steeler has played more. I mean, those aren't things like in baseball where you cherish. Those are things where you're thinking this guy has been and obviously what happened to him. There's more an opportunity that his life's going to be useless. Tony Dorsett,
carnage.
God, every time I hear him interviewed and hear what he's going through, I mean, it does break your heart. I mean, here's a guy who certainly was one of the great memories of my growing up, and it does. You're right, Fletch. It makes you think differently about your memories at that point.
And you talk to these guys on the phone, Dave, and it's incredible. There's equal bit of anger, there's fear, it's really a very emotional thing to sit there and talk with them and say, we want you to start using this tool to be able to monitor where you are. And it's just but then you have people like James Harrison who came out and said, look, I would go through no matter what happens, I'm doing this for my family. If it means that's what's my fate, so be it. I mean, I look at, one of my partners in the business, Gus Farad, who's quarterback, played 15 years. There are days that he has trouble walking. And, he played as a quarterback position, so not one of the positions that really you hear a lot about CTE in that area. But, I look at what he goes through. And, the thing about Gus has been he's been very helpful talking to these other players because, you can talk to them on that level and say, look, you guys need to start looking out for yourselves.
Right.
Well, that's my point about the long term, and I think it's an insular group. I mean, if you're involved in a business like that's not the financial services business or the retailing business or anything else, which is nationwide, and there's hundreds of millions of people in it. At any given time, what is there, 50 guys on an NFL roster, and there's 32 teams. There's 640 of them at a time. Over 5 years, there's potentially 3,000 different ones, right? And there's different eras. I mean, it's a small group, and they all go through the same war zone. You think there'd be a lot more collaboration between the Players Association, the owners, and the past players than there's been, and I think that's a part of this too. And I'm just stunned at the short-term nature of it, and quite frankly, the greed on both ends. The greed on the owners not really worrying about the effects of that stuff for years, maybe not knowing. They're going to say they didn't know. I think they knew more than they let on. And I think the current Players Association should really think about the fact that 10 years from now, Fletch, they're going to be in that same situation.
Yeah,
I think they'd have a little more sympathy for that and hope that the next group would have the same view. But I don't really feel that's the case in the NFL. And I think the NFL, to me, is the most hypocritical of all the professional sports. They all have their issues, but the NFL, to me, is the worst. And this is one of the biggest areas where, quite frankly, they're the biggest hypocrite to me. I mean, watch the highlights for the promos before the games start in the regular season. What do you think you're going to see? You're going to see a lot of the crazy hits and guys getting laid out and that kind of stuff. I mean, if you're really that serious about that, don't put that on there.
Always been a big
glorify that kind of thing. But I'm glad to hear. I don't follow the NFL maybe as closely as you guys do. I'm glad to hear that they're thinking about some of the way tackling's done and some of that kind of stuff. Well, that's a good start. Keep going, because quite frankly, it takes years to change this mentality. So
absolutely. But we're gonna go into our lightning round now, and I know this is the part, Fletch, where you really hone in on Gary's heartless nature. But first we'll start with our memorable moments of the week. And I know you guys are huge soccer fans. Huge, I tell you. But Germany, who is the number one team in the world, had a depth that no team comes close to enjoying. Losing and getting knocked out of the tournament to a team like South Korea, who had no business being on the same field with them, scoring their last two goals in stoppage time to win 2-0, which to me was one of the huge upsets of all time. And then turning around, I've been watching the World Cup since '74, and this has been by far the most exciting. The Belgium-Japan matchup today, which was a top 10 team versus a team that, again, has no business being in a knockout round. And Japan up 2-0. No team has come back down 2-0 in a knockout round since 1970. And Belgium with one of the great names in sport, Lukaku. And I know it's one you like, Fletch.
I do.
But he doesn't score, but he sets up a goal, and Belgium scores 3 goals late in the game, including one as time is about to run out to win 3-2, and what just has to be one of the great games of all time, World Cup or not. But I've just been enjoying the hell out of this Cup, and those 2 games to me were the biggest moments of the week. Now, Gary, your big moment.
Well, excuse me for a second. I don't have I did see the Germany-South Korea thing, and I watched a little bit on TV where people said a lot of the same things you did, but I don't know enough about that. So I don't have real big moments or real big bold predictions again. I'm probably boring this way, so call me if you want, Fletch. But, I mean, to me, it has to be the James thing. I mean, I think we all knew it was coming. But, I mean, that's you got a major NBA player like that going to a major market that's really struggled. To me, that has to be the most memorable thing of the past week. I mean, I guess, I don't know. I mean, to me, hockey-wise, It's something I follow a little more closely than soccer, Dave. I think the Tavares thing, John Tavares leaving the Islanders, no big surprise to me. Might be the death knell for that organization in some ways. Not that they're going to go out of business, but going to continue to struggle. I mean, he was a great player, one of those guys that a lot of people don't pay attention to. Going back home to Toronto, no big surprise, similar to the James thing in L.A., but that's a memorable thing. I mean, I think a lot of people were hoping he would stay in New York and he would make that franchise competitive. I had a feeling he wasn't going to do it. 1 minute into the free agent thing, he signs with Toronto. And then I think the last thing is a small one, but it's interesting. The A's homered at 25 straight road games. Now, that's not just this past week, but that's pretty amazing when you think about it. You only play 81 road games, 125 straight, 1/3 of the season. The A's are going nowhere. Nobody pays any attention, but to me, that was a memorable moment of the past.
I'm pulling out the Mitchell report on him.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, maybe we should start taking a look at Davis and Joyce and Chapman and some of those guys. I agree.
Sons of bitches.
Yep.
Oh, man. I don't want to hear yours, Fletch, but go ahead. I'm going to let you say it anyway.
Well, I'm sorry, David. It has to be the LeBron James thing. And you're right, Gary, it really came as no surprise. I mean, they were talking that, there's a chance for Philadelphia, but basically his agents went to that meeting. LeBron didn't even go to the meeting, so it was pretty much a done deal before that. And when you think about it, guys, it makes sense because he wanted a bigger platform for his business interests. He's a production company that's developed and brought real production to television and movie theaters. So his interests are in other global businesses, and LA is the place to be for that. The other part of it too is that he sees that the Lakers are in a position, with some of the players that they have now, to build a team that can contend for a championship soon. The thing that I liked, that he didn't make those demands that, Kawhi Leonard or Paul George had to join the Lakers for him to sign. He understands that they can build and they can create a contender within there. It's not going to be an immediate thing. Golden State remains the biggest mountain to climb, and Houston is also going to be a huge obstacle. And, I'd say New Orleans is also going to be a tough opponent for LeBron and his young Lakers. But, if you're going to leave Cleveland, you have to go to an iconic franchise. So whether it was going to be, the Sixers or the Knicks or Houston, it had to be somewhere. And for LeBron, this is a new challenge. He came back to Cleveland. He brought them a championship just as he said he would. I think that he left with more dignity this time than he did the last time. And it was a very matter-of-fact press release that just talked about his accomplishments, and he was moving on to L.A. So we'll see what happens with that. The difference really came down to it was Magic Johnson having that meeting with him and saying, look, this and don't forget who his agent was, too, or who the Lakers general manager is, too. This is a guy who was Kobe's agent, and he knows what it takes to land that type of iconic player. So I think all the stars lined up for that one.
And I think a lot of this is about, as you said, his business interest. And while it was irritating to see kind of some of the moves he insisted on in Cleveland, I think a lot of his issues going back to Cleveland and demanding that and not signing a ironclad contract up front and negotiating every year was the fact he didn't trust Gilbert. He didn't trust Gilbert's staff to be able to make the moves to build a championship. And I tended to agree with them. I think when they had him the first time, they kind of botched it up. And certainly, who can blame him after? I didn't like the LeBron show when he left for the Miami Heat. Nobody did, except for Miami Heat fans. But Gilbert, to me, acted worse, acting like a 2-year-old with his little letter to – I have no stars, I have no players, but I'm going to win a championship before LeBron. It was stupid.
It is stupid.
One of the most stupid things I've ever seen a management person do in sports. But I think that was the huge difference with that. I think he trusts the Lakers management, right or wrong. As you said, that's he has experience with them, but he probably trusts them a little better than he does Gilbert. Plus, I think this is a lot about, as you said, Fletch's future. His basketball future is going to be over fairly soon. So, he's setting himself up for the next part of his life. He gave us a championship, and you know what? I'm disappointed he's gone, but I wish him the best.
Well, you look what he did with that team this year. He willed them to it. to a championship.
Never. So that's not a good team on the court. The kid they got from Alabama could make it a little better. I think Love is going to be a little more effective in his role this year than he was last year, but it's still a 35 to 40 win team max.
And keep in mind, he's not an easy player to play with. I mean, you look at Kevin Love did flourish without him, so did Kyrie. So I mean, it's going to be a little bit difficult for these young Lakers, but you know they're going to need to know what their roles are, and I think Luke Walton's going to be a good coach for that.
Yeah, he certainly was impressive in his short stint with the Warriors, but I would tend to agree with you. I think they have a good base, and I think the team as it's put together is better than what Cleveland had last year with them. So I look forward to seeing what they're going to do at this point. But without Paul George in the mix now, I'm not sure there's short of Leonard. There's that guy out there to bring him in and take him to the next level.
And it could be Leonard next year. Who knows? So we'll see what happens.
That to me is going to be interesting.
The thing that I liked was that he didn't go that super team route.
Yeah.
Nobody likes that.
No.
Even if
hopefully on the next bargaining, which I'm not sure it'll go that way, hopefully they'll close up some of those loopholes to make that a little more difficult, because I tend to think that takes the interest out of the end of the playoffs and can take some of the interest. If you know who's going to win in the end, kind of takes a little interest out of it. It's always a little better to have a few teams who are capable of winning a title.
Well, that hasn't been the case in the NBA for a number of years now. I mean, even if you just were a casual watcher, you could probably predict with pretty good certainty which three teams are going to have a chance to play for the title. So that's right. That's the reason to change the loopholes, because quite frankly, I mean, that's got the most imbalance, even more than baseball, like we talked about a couple weeks ago. It's just the imbalance is incredible. So
I mean, look at hockey this year. As we've stated before the salary cap, 2 or 3 teams had a shot, and there were a bunch of bad teams in the playoff. Now, with salary cap hockey, there's a lot of teams that have a shot at a Stanley Cup every year.
Yep.
Which is why the Penguins were the first to repeat since '97.
Yep.
But we'll do our bold, quick predictions since I botched up and last week, and this was an interesting stat, and again, little soccer stat. The 4 teams that won yesterday, or the first 4 teams in the quarterfinals, had an average world rating of 28. The 4 teams that lost had an average world rating of 7. So this is just a bizarre thing. It's interesting as hell and fun. But I'm going to go on the pirate end for my bold prediction of the week. I'm going to say that Josh Harrison and Jordy Mercer will get traded, which isn't much of a bold prediction. But what I'm going to say is the team will be better off having Kramer and Newman manning second and third this year than they would be without those 2 players. I think their defensive game is much more impressive than those 2. Mercer gets balls hit right to him, but can go to his right or left as well as I can. And I think that's going to make a difference for the pitchers a little bit if this happens. And plus, I think those 2 guys are going to be effective hitters in the majors. I think Kramer can even be a consistent 290, 300 hitter there. So I'm going to make that claim that if that happens and these 2 guys get thrown in there, that team is going to be better off this year because of it. Gare?
I mean, mine's a pirate one too, but it's a lot less team moving than that. I just think they're going to miss Nola this weekend. I think they're probably going to miss Pavetta too, been the 2 best Philly starters. The Phillies come out there this weekend, so I know we'll all be hanging on this series over the holiday. I think they're going to sweep the Phillies. I really do. I think the Phillies are one of those teams that play extremely well, like they did the past weekend against Washington. Watch them lose both to Baltimore, 1-2 to Baltimore, or 1-3 to Pittsburgh. So not a particularly earth-moving prediction, but I kind of think Pittsburgh's going to sweep them. I just think the Phillies' 2 starters are top flight. Everybody else is suspect. Vasquez got hit with a line drive on Saturday, which was a ugly line drive hitting him in the arm. I don't know if you guys saw that.
Oh yeah, that was gutsy on the other 2.
Yeah, it was to throw that ball to left-handed, which was amazing.
Yeah.
But I just think that Pittsburgh sweeps them. I think those 2 players, I'll have to look at those, Dave. I agree. I think Harrison's going to bring some value to them. I don't know enough about who's going to replace him, but I think he's probably going to be moved. Mercer, you're not going to get a lot back. I mean, I think after all the things that you've seen over the past couple of years, but I think if I was the Pirates, I'd be doing exactly that wherever I could. And I think the other thing, which is a 1B, and I'm not an expert in this, but I just get a feeling. You listen to Serena Williams, strange things come out of her mouth all the time, but one breath she says, "Oh, I'm back, I'm more motivated after having the kids." The next thing she goes, "Well, not really in shape," and that kind of stuff. She's won 7 Wimbledons. I have a feeling this year she's going to get upset, though. I don't think she's going to win it, which isn't a huge, bold prediction given the news, but I have a feeling somebody from out of the blue is going to upset her. She'll have excuses like she always does, but having a baby, getting up in years, I mean, even though she won 7, that's not her perfect surface from everything I read. I have a feeling she's going to get upset over the weekend. She'll maybe get in the quarterfinals or the 8th, but I think she's going to get upset by somebody who's going to be from Eastern Europe that we won't be able to pronounce their name. So there you go.
And you know what the most exciting thing, getting back to your Pirate Phillies prediction, you know what the most exciting thing about that series is, Gary?
No. Tell me.
Starting lineup is coming back. They're going to have a starting lineup giveaway of a Jameson Taillon figurine. I'm going to call it figurine because Viv calls them dolls. So I'm going to say they're a sports figure.
Patty calls them dolls.
Figures.
The women who come to my house call them dolls too. So
they're wrong. They're wrong. I'm bitter at that, Gary. Tell Patty I'm bitter.
Yep,
Fletcher, finish us up with something bold.
Well, Dave, actually, funny enough, you pretty much took what I was going to talk about. But that's okay, because I'm going to recover. And the other thing I was going to say is that they're going to put Marte in that mix as well. I think they're going to move him. So it's going to be.
Oh, I thought you were going to say he was going to have a starting lineup figure himself.
Yeah. Well, no, they're going to have the Gregory Polanco, which base do I run to, starting lineup figure.
Run down the third base line.
Oh. He may be the worst base runner I've ever seen. Honest to God.
Well, generally when you hear base running error, the name Gregory Polanco, I think it's mandated that comes after it.
Oh, I do believe. So I'm going to go with a backup prediction here.
Okay.
And there's going to be a nice little Penguins event that's going to happen. It's going to be an event for charity.
Okay. Where
Jim Rutherford and John Tortorella are going to face off in a cage match, no holds barred, and we're gonna set this whole thing to rest. Just when you think you can't hate John Tortorella anymore, something like this happens. It's unbelievable. I mean, I used to really despise Barry Trotz because just the look on his face, he just looked like he was constantly constipated. But Tortorella, a guy who he would complain about the Penguins. Ooh, they're whiners. Ooh, they're arrogant. And then he says, why is another general manager making comments about my team? Come on now.
Well, I will say, and again, didn't watch as closely as maybe you guys did, but when you win 2 games in your opponent's arena, there's no way in hell you should lose a series. So he obviously screwed up somehow to allow that to happen. Whether it was Johnson not being in the lineup or not, I don't know. But to make it sound like, I shouldn't be criticized for anything, makes you sound like an ass when you blow a series like that. I don't care who it is. You win 2 games in a 7-game series in your opponent's home arena or field, you should win that series.
You really should.
You have a significant advantage at that point.
Now, that all being said, I will say that I thought Jim Rutherford was out of line with his comment.
It was funny.
It was funny. It was definitely funny.
What was his comment? I didn't see it, honestly. What was his comment?
Well, he basically said that he was talking about they signed Johnson, and
right.
He hadn't played in a few of the last games. He was a healthy scratch, and but Rutherford basically said, well, it certainly wasn't about performance. It was about something else, and we know what it was.
Okay.
And he didn't say what it was, and he just
everybody knows what it was.
Yeah. It was. That's just you don't say stuff.
It was a stupid thing to say, and it was out of line, but, it was torch, so it made for good press.
It did. And like I said, it's hard to hate him anymore, but, by God, I was able to.
Now, one last question before we end this, Fletch. What was Gary's heartless bastard meter this week?
What did I do this
Oh,
week?
he is Mr. Warmth this week. He is he is a man of the common baseball player, of the non-stars. So you just radiated warmth all over the place today.
Well, thank you, Fletch. See, I mean, I think it's the effect of you guys. So, you know, it's the effect of dealing with you guys on a regular basis. So,
there you go. You're a man that makes people more sensitive, Fletch.
Make them
Is that the reputation you want?
Oh, I'll pummel you into submission, yes. And make you more sensitive.
I'm going to go out and have a beer with Tortorella next time I'm out in Columbus. So.
I think he'd be afraid of you, Gary, in the end.
Probably.
Oh, man.
Probably.
All right, gentlemen, until next week, you have a nice evening.
You too, gentlemen.
All righty.
Later.